What's the fear with genetically modified organisms, GMO, as regards foods, either crops or animal foods? Do you know we can also have genetically modified human beings? And that's where the fear comes in, right? Now, let me explain genetically modified human beings. There's something called gene therapy that is supposed to be used to treat genetic conditions, whether it's sickle cell disease, thalassemia, cystic fibrosis, all the different enzyme deficiencies, porphyrias, and all of that, right? Phenylketonuria, several enzyme deficiencies. Gene therapy is supposed to be used to be able to tweak the genes, those defaulted or defected genes or defective genes, go and correct the genes using gene therapy. That's genetic modification of a human being to treat a disease. Now, what are the fears with genetic modification of human beings? There's a fear that, it might fall into the hands of the wrong people. For instance, one government might say, we're going to use gene modification to create soldiers that are 8 feet tall, very fast, have, very sharp mental acuity, very smart, very fast, very tall soldiers to build our military base. And people could use it for several things. One crazy scientist might come out and say, you know what, I want to just, out of fun, just because I'm feeling like it, let me create a human being with 7 heads by genetically tweaking the genes. Maybe create a human being with 20 legs just for fun. One crazy scientist might do that and we'll start creating aliens, right? Misuse of gene therapy or genetic modification in human beings. These are the ethical concerns. Another thing is that there's a fear that even when gene therapy or genetic modification is used for the right purpose to treat genetic diseases or chromosomal problems, right? That sometimes, because gene therapy involves either adding a gene, removing a gene, deletion, or tweaking, changing some of those nucleotides, those points in the genes, there are fears that while you're trying to treat a genetic condition, you might end up creating other genes, which we call oncogenes or proto-oncogenes or pro-oncogenes, those genes that encourage cancer development or cancer formation. These are fears that even when you're trying to use it for the right reason, you might still create genes accidentally that might increase the person's risk of developing several cancers. Now, bearing that in mind, let's move to agriculture, both crop agriculture and animal husbandry. When it comes to agriculture and genetic modification of plants and animals, the same principle applies. The intended benefit is usually to increase yield so that the crops can grow bigger, so that the crop that you're supposed to harvest in 6 months, you probably harvest it in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, much earlier, faster yield, higher turnover. That's the intended positive benefit to genetic modification in agriculture. Now, what are the fears? Same as human genetic modification. There's a fear that while you're tweaking those genes in the crops and animals for an intended positive benefit, that you might end up creating genes that might increase the likelihood of the person consuming that food over time of developing several cancers, of developing alterations, disruptions in their hormones, what we call endocrine disruptions. They might become more prone to developing type 2 diabetes. They might become more prone to having fertility problems, having polycystic ovary-like manifestations and other hormonal alterations or disruptions. These are fears. Another fear is that the tweaking of those genes in those plants and animals that, they might create a proto-oncogenic effect as well, increasing a person's risk of developing cancers from consuming these foods over time. Now, another concern is that it will be very difficult to prove or disprove that if a person develops a health condition from eating a genetically modified plant or animal, it will be very difficult to prove that the consumption of that GMO food caused that person's health problem. So reporting of incidents and side effects and complications will be very, very, very difficult, which means the manufacturers of these foods will not take up the liability for anything that comes up. Now, how about we say that companies that want to do this gene modification have clear labels that state exactly what type of gene modification was done and the potential long-term complications or risks associated with that gene modification, such that we can then hold them accountable or liable if people start having certain disease conditions. What do you think? Scientifically, I think there's a benefit to it, but then there are serious potential risk or complications that can come from gene modifications, whether it's done in human beings, plants, or animals. And that's where the ethical concern around gene modification or GMOs lies. And until that ethical concern, which is a serious concern, is well addressed, we will say it's a huge risk promoting GMO foods. You're just experimenting with human beings. That's what it is. It's an experimentation with the health and lives of people to see. It's like the GMO companies are using we, the consumers, to do their prospective studies. They're using us to do the prospective studies to find out whether any long-term complications will arise without paying us for the research.